They fired me on a Thursday. Not even a dramatic meeting, just a short organizational restructuring notice delivered by a CFO who'd been with the company for 6 weeks and still didn't know which server room required biometric access. He said it with this tone, like he couldn't believe someone with only 21 years of experience still existed in a company he intended to rebuild from scratch. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. Because the moment he slid that paper across the desk, I realized something he hadn't. He had just removed the only person who actually understood the skeleton of the company he wanted to cut open. Their systems weren't ordinary. They were old, ancient, by corporate standards, stitched together with decades of custom integrations, one-of-a-kind automations, back-end scripts nobody had touched since the Bush administration, and emergency patches that only ran because I remembered why they existed. The CFO, young, ambitious, and all spreadsheets no substance, assumed IT systems were plug and play. That the cloud, or whatever new buzzword he was parroting, could magically replace craftsmanship built by hands like mine. He saw me as a line item. I saw him as a countdown. When I packed my things, nobody said anything. They didn't have to. The developers knew. The analysts knew. Even the HR rep walking me out looked nervous, as if she were escorting someone out of a nuclear plant after they'd just reminded everyone where the failsafe switch was. And the funniest part? I wasn't angry. I wasn't insulted. I was amused. Because as the badge reader blinked red for the last time, I thought about the dozens, maybe hundreds, of back-end dependencies that had been tied to my root credentials. Not intentionally. Just historically. That's what happens when you're the first one to build something and the last one maintaining it. The architecture grows around you. On Monday, 3 days after my exit, the first outage hit. A small one. Payroll integrations failed. People didn't panic at first, these things happen. But payroll was tied to identity sync, which was tied to contractor access, which triggered an automated security sweep because the system interpreted it as mass credential spoofing. Every contractor badge deactivated. Facilities froze. The CFO blamed legacy infrastructure. He wasn't wrong, but he didn't understand that legacy infrastructure was the only thing holding everything else upright. By Wednesday, the database cluster fell out of sync. That one was beautiful. A single failover routine didn't fire because the script that triggered it ran on a machine they had, ironically, power cycled to optimize costs. That script was one line. One. And it had been handwritten by me 15 years earlier during a snowstorm when the primary node overheated. I wasn't proud of how fragile it still was. I'd recommended replacing it for years, but no one had ever approved the budget. Now every transaction timestamp was off by hours, corrupting everything downstream. Billing. Inventory. Cash flow projections. Audit logs. The CFO didn't sleep that night. A week later, they tried bringing in an outside firm. Smart move, in theory. Except consultants don't fix systems like ours. They rebuild them. And they charge obscene amounts for it. Not to mention, the moment they dug into the architecture, one of them asked the CFO a simple question: "Where's your original system documentation?" I laughed when I heard that. There was documentation. Thousands of pages worth. I wrote most of it. But my documentation wasn't sitting in their neat corporate wiki. It was stored in an encrypted knowledge vault, something the company paid for. Something tied to a license. Something tied to my name. Something that deactivated automatically when my employment ended. The consultants lasted 2 days. By the second week, the board stepped in. Nobody said it officially, but everyone knew the company was paralyzed. They couldn't onboard employees. Couldn't bill clients. Couldn't reconcile accounts. Couldn't run metrics. couldn't access archives. Every digital limb was dead or twitching. And the CFO? He tried to blame me. Tried loudly. Then quietly. Then desperately. But the board had been around longer than he had. They knew systems like ours didn't collapse because someone left. They collapsed because someone essential was removed. In the end, they reached out to me through a third party. First politely. Then urgently. And finally, with compensation that made me check if the decimal point was in the right place. I didn't gloat. I didn't lecture. I didn't even return to the office. I rebuilt everything remotely, professionally, cleanly. Then I built new systems, better ones. Ones that didn't rely on human memory or 17-year-old patches. And when the board quietly offered me a position above the CFO, I declined. I didn't need the title. I didn't need the office. I didn't need revenge spelled out. I already watched it happen. The CFO resigned. Personal reasons. Meanwhile, I built something new, this time for myself. A consultancy with a waiting list long enough to make me grateful I'd been fired in the first place. Some doors close loudly. This one closed quietly, but with consequences that echoed for months. And honestly, it was the most satisfying silence I've ever heard. But the part no one knew, the part that made this whole thing hit even harder, came afterward. Systems weren't the only thing I had built over those years. I had built relationships. Real ones. The kind where people came to your desk not because they had to, but because they trusted that you'd give them the truth, not corporate sugarcoating. And when everything collapsed, those same people quietly reached out, not to complain, not to gossip, but to tell me what was really happening inside. Department heads were holding emergency meetings back to back. Managers were printing records to avoid losing everything to corrupted logs. Entire teams were being told to pause all activity because nobody knew which data was accurate. And the CFO? He had become a ghost in his own office. Shades drawn. Phone on silent. Walking the hallways only when he thought nobody was around. One employee told me she heard him shouting behind closed doors, insisting that everything was recoverable if they just let him overhaul the infrastructure. But by then, even he knew the truth, he wasn't dealing with outdated systems. He was dealing with consequences. The board, meanwhile, wanted answers. The kind with precise numbers and exact timelines. They weren't the type you could distract with buzzwords or modern-sounding plans. They wanted to know why a company that had run flawlessly for more than 2 decades suddenly fell apart the moment one person left. They wanted to know why there was no redundancy, no contingency planning, no cross-trained staff. They wanted to know why the CFO had removed the only senior systems architect without a transition plan. And above all, they wanted the company back on its feet. When they approached me with the offer, more of a plea, really, they expected anger, bitterness, gloating. But all I felt was clarity. I told them the truth plainly: you don't have a systems issue. You have a leadership issue. And for the first time in weeks, nobody argued. They listened. Not because I was some kind of corporate villain turned savior, but because everything I had warned them about over the years had finally caught up. Once I stabilized the systems, I recommended a gradual rebuild, something strong, modern, self-sustaining. Something that couldn't be taken down because one person left. And though they wanted me to lead the entire transformation internally, I turned it down again. I'd done my time. 21 years of building, patching, saving deadlines, and putting out fires had earned me something better than another title. They had also earned me the freedom to choose how I spent the rest of my career. What I didn't expect, though, was the reaction from employees. My inbox filled with messages, hundreds of them, from people thanking me not for fixing the system, but for showing them that integrity could still win in a place like that. Many said they were staying because they felt hope again. Others said my choice to walk away inspired them to rethink their own paths. And when news spread that the CFO had chosen to pursue new opportunities elsewhere, nobody believed it. They didn't need to. Justice had been done, not loudly, not explosively, but in a quiet, unmistakable way that makes people rethink every smug decision they ever made. The company survived. Eventually even thrived. And me? I built my consultancy exactly the way I built those old systems, with precision, patience, and the kind of experience you can't fake. Clients lined up. Former coworkers recommended me. Other companies that had heard about the incident quietly asked for audits of their own legacy systems. Turns out when a company nearly collapses because one expert leaves, that expert becomes the most in-demand person in the industry. Funny how that works. And if I'm being honest, the revenge wasn't the collapse, or the chaos, or the CFO's downfall. The real revenge was the moment I realized I would never again work under someone who didn't understand my worth. For the first time in decades, I wasn't someone's employee. I was the expert they needed. And they all knew it. What came next surprised even me. I expected a few consulting contracts, maybe some system audits, nothing earth-shattering. But within 3 months, I was drowning in work, not because companies suddenly cared about their infrastructure, but because word had spread. Quietly. Like an industry secret no one wanted to admit openly. If you don't want your company to end up like that one, talk to him. It wasn't the disaster that made me legendary, it was the lesson behind it. Executives hate surprises, and nothing terrifies them like losing control over something they didn't understand. So they sought me out, not as a technician, but as someone who could save them from the kind of arrogance that had almost destroyed my last workplace. Funny thing is, I didn't have to pitch anything. They came to me humbled, ready to listen, ready to invest in safety rather than speed. And for the first time in decades, I was working with people who actually valued the expertise they were paying for. CEOs sat in meetings, quietly. Board members took notes. Some even apologized for the way your industry is treated. That part hit harder than I expected. Because when you've spent half your life keeping a company stable while leadership takes the credit, it's strange to finally sit across from people who see what you do as essential, not invisible. Meanwhile, back at my old company, things kept changing. People who had once been ignored were suddenly being listened to. Departments that had been underfunded were revamped. The IT team, once considered optional, received the biggest investment in company history. They hired 3 system architects and 2 compliance experts just to spread the responsibility I once carried alone. I won't lie. A part of me wondered if they wished they'd listened sooner. But I didn't hold on to that thought. I'd moved forward. They were just now catching up. One afternoon, nearly a year after my exit, I got a message from one of my former coworkers. It was short, just a photo. The company had unveiled a wall installation featuring the founders and key contributors over the decades. And there, tucked between 2 framed patents, was a plaque with my name on it. No ceremony. No publicity. Just quiet acknowledgement. I stared at it for a long time. Not because I needed the recognition, I didn't, but because they finally understood a truth that had been invisible for years. Success isn't built by the loudest leaders, but by the people who keep the gears turning while those leaders make speeches. But the real turning point came during a tech conference 6 months later. I was invited as a keynote speaker, not because of my old job, but because of the systems consultancy that had exploded out of nowhere. As I walked on stage, looking out over an audience of CTOs, CISOs, engineers, architects, executives, all waiting for insights, I realized what real revenge looked like. It wasn't destruction. It was elevation. It was standing in a place they never imagined I'd reach, while they now quietly followed my work from a distance. During the Q&A, someone asked, "What do you think about companies that fire senior experts for cost-cutting?" The audience waited for something fiery. Something petty. Something bitter. But I just smiled. "Well," I said, "every expert you underestimate becomes an asset for someone else. And sometimes, that someone else is themselves." The applause lasted longer than I expected. And that's when it fully clicked. Getting fired was never the end of my story. It was the start of a chapter one didn't know I needed. A chapter where my skill wasn't hidden behind a corporation's logo, where no CFO could rewrite my worth, and where no restructuring memo could erase decades of knowledge. In the end, they lost control of their systems for a few weeks. I gained control of my future forever. And between the two, I'd say I got the better deal. A few months later, something happened that tied everything together in a way I never could have planned. I received an invitation, formal, embossed, the kind companies send when they're trying too hard to look composed. It was from my old company's new CEO. Not the CFO, he was long gone. This was someone the board brought in from outside, someone seasoned, someone who didn't need to inflate themselves to feel important. She wanted to meet. Curiosity got the better of me, so I agreed. When I walked into the building, the security guard recognized me instantly and just nodded with this look, half respect, half relief. As I waited in the lobby, I noticed something subtle but powerful. The tension that had clung to the place for years was gone. People weren't scrambling, whispering, or walking on eggshells. The air didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt functional. The new CEO met me in the conference room where I'd once sat through countless budget rejections. But this time, she wasn't there to grill or posture. She started with something simple. "Thank you," she said. Not ceremonially. Not formally. Just honestly. "You warned them. They ignored you. And you saved this company anyway." I didn't expect that. I'd moved on, but hearing it out loud, finally, hit something inside me I didn't realize was still bruised. She went on to explain how the board had undergone its own transformation after the collapse. They'd realized how much they had misjudged the core of their operations. They'd realized the CFO's obsession with cost-cutting had blinded them. And they'd realized how fragile everything had been under the surface. Then she told me something even more surprising. They had created a new internal division, one focused on system legacy transitions, risk assessment, and longevity planning. And they named the framework after me. Not as branding. Not as marketing. But as a reminder to never again build a company so dependent on the shoulders of a single person without recognizing that person's value. I didn't know what to say at first. Recognition is strange. You think you don't care, until someone finally gives it sincerely, and then you feel this quiet peace settle into place. Before I left, the CEO asked if there was anything she could do for me, not professionally, but in the spirit of respect. I shook my head. "You've already done it," I said. "You listened." A few days later, one of my old coworkers called. "The culture here is different now," he said. "They actually ask us what we think. Things are documented. Budgets get approved. IT isn't treated like a fire extinguisher anymore." It was small. But it meant everything. Because my revenge wasn't supposed to destroy a company. It wasn't supposed to punish innocent people. It wasn't meant to leave a crater. It was meant to force a moment of clarity, one that had been overdue for years. And it worked. But just when I thought the entire story had wrapped itself neatly, something happened that made me realize revenge sometimes echoes far beyond the moment. At the next industry conference, I found myself surrounded by people asking for advice, not just on systems, but on leadership, structure, culture, retention. I'd accidentally become the voice for every senior expert who'd ever been dismissed by someone younger, louder, or more politically connected. And halfway through that event, a man approached me, nervous, sweating, carrying a folder that looked far too polished. He introduced himself. He was a CEO of a company that had just hired a new CFO. A CFO who reminded him a little too much of the guy your story was about. He wanted preventative consulting. Not because anything was broken, but because he didn't want to repeat someone else's mistake. For the first time in my life, I realized my revenge had become something bigger, something constructive. Something that changed how companies treated people like me everywhere. And that's the thing nobody tells you about the justice you earn through competence. It doesn't just put your enemies in their place. It elevates everyone who needed someone to prove the point. As I flew home that evening, I looked out over the city lights, feeling something I hadn't felt in decades. Not victory. Not pride. Not triumph. Freedom. The kind that comes only after you've outgrown the places that once underestimated you, and built a life where no one ever could again. Not long after that conference, the past circled back in a way I never expected. A major financial publication reached out. They were doing a feature on the hidden cost of firing expertise. I agreed to a short interview, thinking it would be a few quotes buried under some charts and statistics. But when the article went live, my story was the opener. Not by name, not with any confidential details, just the outline of what had happened, framed as a cautionary tale for leadership teams across the industry. The headline was brutal, almost poetic. When ego fires expertise, entire companies pay the price. Within hours, it spread everywhere. Executives posted it on LinkedIn. Engineers shared it with comments like, "This is exactly why we document everything." HR departments discussed it internally. Even business schools picked it up for their case study libraries. But the most surprising part? Someone sent me a screenshot from the comments section. The CFO, the one who fired me, had replied. It was short, defensive, and painfully revealing. This story is exaggerated. No single employee is irreplaceable. The replies underneath shredded him. Dozens of industry veterans pushed back with first-hand experiences. Some even referenced the collapse of my former company without knowing I was watching. His comment disappeared within an hour. 3 days later, so did his entire online presence. That told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't working in finance anymore. Not in tech. Not in operations. Not anywhere that required trust or responsibility. Word gets around fast in this industry, especially when leadership mistakes cause public damage. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger toward him. I felt clarity. He wasn't evil. He wasn't strategic. He wasn't even malicious. He was small. And small people break big systems when they're given power they don't understand. But me? I wasn't tied to that smallness anymore. My consultancy kept growing, not explosively, but steadily, with the calm reliability that comes from a career built on real skill. I hired assistants. Then junior architects. Then 2 senior engineers who had walked away from toxic companies of their own. Together, we created something I wish I'd had 20 years earlier, a team that valued each other, trusted each other, and treated every contribution as vital. We were invited to speak at universities. We helped startups build systems responsibly from the ground up. We audited major corporations and quietly prevented disasters no one will ever know about. That's the thing about real expertise, it protects people quietly. It builds futures you never see collapsing, because they never get close to breaking. One evening, about a year and a half after everything happened, I received a message from a former intern who had been at the company during the chaos. "Hey," she wrote. I just wanted to say, I stayed in tech because of you. You showed me what real leadership looks like. I sat with that message for a long time. Because in the end, the true legacy wasn't the system collapsing. It wasn't the CFO falling from grace. It wasn't the consultancy or the keynote speeches. It was knowing that my years of work, those long nights, those impossible deadlines, those systems I held together with grit and patience, had meant something. Something real. Something lasting. It meant someone learned from me. Someone grew from what I built. Someone avoided a mistake because they'd watched me stand my ground. And that was worth more than any paycheck, any title, any corner office they could have offered. Years later, whenever I'd pass by the old building or hear someone mention that company, I didn't feel bitterness anymore. I felt gratitude. Strange, unexpected gratitude. Because getting fired didn't break my career. It freed it. It didn't end my story. It rewrote it. And it didn't take anything from me. It gave me back everything I'd forgotten I deserved. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's becoming the person they should have treated right in the first place, and doing it on your own terms. A couple more years went by, and with distance came perspective I never expected to gain. I wasn't just moving forward, I was evolving in ways that the old job would have never allowed. When you work in one place for decades, especially in a role where chaos follows you around, you start to shrink without realizing it. You begin to think your value is tied only to emergencies, outages, and late-night saves. But once I left, I realized something important. I had spent years preventing disasters. Now, I was building futures. One morning, while finalizing a system blueprint for a major healthcare network, I caught myself smiling at the screen, not because of the project, but because of how far things had shifted. The work felt lighter. Not easier, but lighter. I wasn't fighting upstream anymore. I wasn't battling directors for budgets or convincing CFOs that security mattered. I wasn't defending my decisions to people who didn't even speak the same technical language. Every client now came to me already convinced of my worth. And that alone was a kind of revenge, quiet, clean, dignified. The real twist came one afternoon during a leadership roundtable. I was asked a simple question: what's the biggest mistake companies make with technical experts? My answer came out before I even thought. They assume expertise is replaceable. It's not. Skills can be replaced. People can't. There was silence in the room, but not the uncomfortable kind. More like understanding settling into the air. Leaders nodded slowly, some taking notes, others lost in thought, probably replaying every senior engineer they'd pushed out or ignored over the years. Later that evening, a CTO pulled me aside. "You know," he said quietly, "when you told that story about your old CFO a while back, I see that pattern everywhere. Companies elevate people who know money, but not systems. People who know numbers, but not operations. They think stability is a given, right up until the day it's not." He paused, then added, almost reluctantly, "You changed how I hire." It struck me harder than I expected. My story wasn't just a personal victory anymore. It was helping reshape the culture of an entire field, one conversation at a time. Meanwhile, my old company continued healing. Under its new leadership, the place slowly rebuilt its reputation. They didn't pretend the collapse never happened, they used it as a lesson. Departments were reorganized with more transparency. Experts were given actual seats at the table. Junior staff were mentored instead of ignored. It wasn't perfect, but it was far better than the place I had left. The unexpected part? Some of the younger engineers who joined after I left reached out for advice, mentorship, or just to hear the full story. They'd heard the legend, the meltdown, the mistake, the rebuilding, and wanted to learn from it. So I walked them through the truth, not dramatized, not softened. Just exactly what happens when a company forgets that the people keeping everything running aren't optional. And somewhere along the way, a realization settled in: the CFO didn't ruin my life. He redirected it. His incompetence pushed me into a career I should have started years earlier. His arrogance gave me clarity. His decision gave me freedom. One night, sitting on my balcony, looking at the city lights spread out like a circuit board below me, I understood something profound. Revenge isn't always about the downfall of those who wronged you. Sometimes, the real revenge is becoming untouchable. Not because you seek power, but because you finally recognize your own value. My story didn't end with chaos. It didn't end with collapse. It ended with growth, mine, theirs, and the countless others who learned from what happened. And today, when companies bring me in, they don't just want systems stability, they want culture stability. They want to avoid becoming the next cautionary tale. They want to build workplaces where expertise is respected, not tolerated. And maybe that's the biggest twist of all: in trying to erase me, the CFO made me impossible to ignore. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was legacy. In the end, I didn't need an apology from the CFO, or recognition, or even the satisfaction of watching everything fall apart. Life handled that on its own. What I gained was worth far more than any revenge I could have engineered. I gained clarity. I gained confidence. And most of all, I gained a life that wasn't defined by someone else's short-sighted decisions. Sometimes the universe clears a path by removing you from places that no longer deserve you. That firing felt like a door slamming in my face, but it was actually a gate unlocking somewhere else entirely. Now, when I look back, I don't feel anger or bitterness. I just feel gratitude for the strange, chaotic way everything unfolded. If they hadn't pushed me out, I would have stayed loyal to a job that had long since stopped valuing me. I would have kept shrinking to fit a place I'd outgrown. But I didn't shrink. I expanded. And the company, after all its upheaval, learned the hard lesson it had avoided for years: you can't build anything lasting on disrespect, not systems, not businesses, not cultures. As for me, I walked away, built something stronger, and became someone their narrow vision never could have contained. They fired their only systems expert. They paid the price. And I moved on to a future they never imagined. That's not revenge. That's evolution.